The day my father's attorney told me my younger brother owned the company I had spent 20 years helping build, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand another reading of the paperwork. I just sat there, staring at my father's empty chair across the conference table, trying to understand how 2 decades of early mornings, missed weekends, unpaid emergencies, and promises could disappear in less than 5 minutes. My brother, Nolan, sat beside me with a look of practiced sadness. Then he reached across the table and said, "Dad made his choice, Grant. We have to respect it." So I did, for 11 days. Then an old employee showed up at my house carrying a yellowed folder. Inside was a copy of my father's business succession agreement. Everything matched the official paperwork, except for one page that had somehow vanished. And on that page, in my father's handwriting, were 6 words that changed everything. Grant is to retain controlling interest. That was when I realized my brother hadn't inherited my father's company. He had taken it, and he had been preparing to erase me long before our father became too weak to stop him. My name is Grant Holloway, and for most of my adult life, Holloway Industrial Supply was more than the place where I worked. It was the center of my relationship with my father. My dad, Everett Holloway, started the company in a rented warehouse outside Columbus, Ohio, when I was 13. At the beginning, there were 3 employees, 1 delivery truck, and a metal desk with a drawer that jammed every time you opened it. Dad sold replacement parts and maintenance supplies to small manufacturing companies. Nothing glamorous. But he understood people. He remembered customers' names, employees' kids, and every promise he ever made. When I graduated from high school, Dad encouraged me to attend college. I did. I studied business operations, came home 4 years later, and asked him for a job. He handed me a broom. "You want people here to respect you," he said. "Earn it from the floor up." So I did. I worked inventory, then deliveries, then purchasing, then sales. By 30, I was managing daily operations. By 38, I was negotiating our largest supplier contracts and overseeing nearly 60 employees. Dad was still the owner, but everyone knew we ran the company together. My younger brother, Nolan, had a very different relationship with the business. Nolan was 5 years younger than me. He was smart, charming, and capable of making people like him within minutes. He was also allergic to anything that required patience. Dad gave him opportunities. A lot of them. At 24, Nolan joined the sales team. He lasted 7 months. At 27, Dad put him in charge of marketing. Nolan quit after an argument over budgets. At 31, he came back and convinced Dad he wanted responsibility. 6 months later, he left again to pursue a business idea with a friend. Every time Nolan walked away, Dad defended him. "He's finding himself," Dad would say. I never argued. Because I loved my brother. And because, back then, I never imagined we were competing. When Dad turned 68, he began talking seriously about retirement. One evening, after most of the staff had gone home, he came into my office and closed the door. He sat across from me and looked strangely tired. "Grant," he said, "you know this place better than I do now." I laughed. "That's not true." "It is." Then he looked around my office. "You stayed." 2 simple words. But I understood what he meant. I stayed when the recession nearly cost us half our customers. I stayed when a warehouse fire shut down one section of the building for 3 weeks. I stayed when Dad needed surgery and couldn't work for 2 months. And I stayed every time Nolan disappeared. Dad leaned forward. "When I'm finished, I want you running this company." I didn't ask about ownership. I didn't ask about percentages. I just said, "I'll take care of it." He smiled. I know. That conversation stayed between us. Or at least I thought it did. A few weeks later, Dad brought in his longtime attorney, Miriam Cole. Miriam had handled the company's legal matters for almost 15 years. She was careful, organized, and not the kind of person who seemed easily pressured. Several meetings followed. Some included me. Some included Nolan. Some were only Dad and Miriam. Dad told us he wanted both sons treated fairly, but he also made one point very clear. Ownership and control were not the same thing. Nolan would receive financial value. I would retain management control. At least, that was what Dad told me. And for the next 2 years, I never had a reason to question him. Dad's health declined gradually. At first, it was fatigue. Then memory problems. Nothing dramatic. He would forget appointments or repeat a story. Eventually, I started handling more decisions. Nolan also returned to the company. This time, surprisingly, he stayed. He told me he wanted to help because Dad was getting older. I believed him. In fact, I was relieved. For the first time in years, it felt like my brother and I might finally become partners instead of strangers connected by the same last name. Nolan began spending more time with Dad privately. He drove him to appointments. He helped him organize files at home. He started attending meetings that had once been my responsibility. I didn't object. Dad was our father. If Nolan wanted to rebuild that relationship, I wasn't going to stand in the way. But looking back, there were signs. Small ones. Nolan began asking questions about voting shares. He wanted to know which accounts required 2 signatures. He asked who had access to corporate records. Once, he casually asked where Dad kept his signed legal copies. I assumed he was finally taking the company seriously. Now I know he was studying it. About 8 months before Dad passed, our controller sent me a document requiring his approval. I carried it into Dad's office. He was staring at paperwork on his desk. "You okay?" I asked. He looked up. "Did I approve this?" He held up a corporate authorization form. I checked it. His signature was there. "I guess so." Dad frowned. "I don't remember signing it." I looked closer. The document gave Nolan temporary authority to communicate with one of our financial institutions. Nothing extraordinary. But Dad seemed troubled. "I wouldn't give him this without talking to you." I remember smiling. "You probably just forgot." Dad nodded. But he didn't look convinced. That should have been the moment I started asking questions. Instead, I protected Nolan. I told myself Dad's memory was declining. I told myself my brother was helping. I told myself families survive by trusting each other. I didn't understand that trust becomes dangerous when only one person is honoring it. By the last 4 months of Dad's life, he was working from home most days. I visited every evening. Nolan was often already there. Sometimes papers covered the dining table. Whenever I asked what they were working on, Nolan gave me the same answer. Just helping Dad organize everything. One evening, I noticed Dad looked irritated. After Nolan left, Dad called me into the kitchen. "Your brother keeps pushing me to change things." "What things?" "The company." I felt my stomach tighten. "What does he want changed?" Dad rubbed his forehead. "He thinks everything should be simpler." I asked him directly, "Do you want Nolan controlling the company?" Dad looked at me like the question offended him. "No." Then he said something I would remember later. "Grant, you built this beside me." He didn't. I wish I had recorded that conversation. I wish I had asked Miriam for copies of every signed document. But family relationships rarely collapse in the moment you expect. Most betrayals only become obvious when you look backward. Dad passed early on a Tuesday morning. He was 72. The next several days felt unreal. Employees sent messages. Customers called. People I had never met told me stories about how Dad had helped them. Nolan and I handled everything together. And for those few days, I forgot every concern I had ever had about him. He was my brother. We had lost our father. I thought grief had made us equal again. 11 days later, Miriam asked us to meet at her office. I expected financial details. Real estate. Insurance. Maybe instructions about Dad's remaining ownership shares. What I did not expect was for Miriam to place a document on the conference table and say, "Under Everett's final executed succession agreement, Nolan receives 51% controlling ownership of Holloway Industrial Supply." I thought I had misunderstood. I looked at Nolan. He lowered his eyes. Miriam continued, "I would receive 34%. The remaining 15% would be distributed through a family trust." I barely heard the rest. Finally, I asked one question. "When was this signed?" Miriam looked at the document. "About 6 weeks before your father passed." 6 weeks. During a period when Dad sometimes forgot what day it was. After the meeting, Nolan followed me into the parking lot. "Grant." I kept walking. "Grant, wait." I turned. He looked upset. Maybe he really was. I didn't know Dad was going to do this. That sentence mattered later. At the time, I believed him. I said, "He told me something completely different." Nolan shrugged sadly. Maybe he changed his mind. 6 weeks before he died, he was still making decisions. I looked at him for a long time. Then he said the sentence that made me stop fighting before the fight had even begun. "Dad made his choice. We have to respect it." So I did. I spent the next week convincing myself ownership didn't matter. I still had 34%. I still had a job. I still had 20 years of relationships inside that building. Maybe Dad really had changed his mind. Maybe I had mistaken loyalty for entitlement. That was the hardest part. I started questioning myself instead of questioning what had happened. 3 days after the paperwork became official, Nolan called a leadership meeting. He sat in Dad's chair, not beside it, in it. I noticed. Everyone noticed. Nolan announced that the company needed modernization. He changed approval procedures, moved 2 department managers, and removed my authority over several financial decisions. Afterward, I asked him why. Efficiency, he said. You've been here less than 2 years continuously, and now I own the company. There was no sadness in his voice anymore. No grieving brother. No reluctant heir. This was someone who had been waiting. Over the next week, Nolan changed my title from Chief Operating Officer to Senior Operations Advisor. Same salary, far less authority. When I confronted him, he said, "Grant, maybe it's time you stopped acting like Dad's second-in-command." That sentence hurt more than losing control of the company, because he knew exactly what my relationship with Dad had been. He wasn't simply replacing me. He was rewriting me. His name was Walter Pierce. Walter had worked for Dad for 26 years. He had retired the previous spring. On a rainy Thursday evening, he showed up at my house carrying a folder. I hadn't seen him since Dad's memorial service. He wouldn't come inside at first. He just stood beneath my porch light and asked, "Did Everett leave the company to Nolan?" I nodded. Walter's face changed. "That's not what he told me." My heart started beating faster. "What did he tell you?" Walter looked toward the street. Then he handed me the folder. "I found this while cleaning out some files your father asked me to store." Inside were copies of supplier contracts, insurance papers, and one document titled, "Business Succession Agreement, Draft for Execution." I recognized most of it immediately. It looked almost identical to what Miriam had shown us. Same formatting, same section numbers, same dates. Except this copy had 12 pages. The official agreement had 11. Page 7 was the missing page. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down. The section explained how voting control would transfer after Dad's passing. It stated that Nolan and I would both inherit equity. But it also said, Grant Holloway shall retain 51% of voting authority due to his operational tenure and long-term management responsibilities. Below that paragraph was a handwritten note from Dad. I knew his handwriting immediately. Grant is to retain controlling interest. My throat tightened. Walter sat across from me. Everett was clear about this. "When did he give you this copy?" "About 3 months before he passed." "Why?" Walter hesitated. He said too many papers were moving around the office. That sentence changed the temperature in the room. I asked, "Did he say someone was changing things?" Walter shook his head. "Not directly." Then he added, "But he asked me to keep this somewhere Nolan couldn't access." The next morning, I called Miriam. I didn't tell Nolan. I placed Walter's copy on her desk. She turned the pages slowly. When she reached page 7, she stopped. Her face went pale. "Where did you get this?" "Walter Pierce." She read Dad's handwritten note. Then she opened a digital file on her computer. For nearly 10 minutes, she said nothing. Finally, she whispered, "This version should not exist outside my archive." "What does that mean?" "It means this was very close to the final version." Was Dad's intention for me to control the company? She looked at me. "At one point, yes." "At one point." Miriam removed her glasses. "Grant, your father later signed a revised agreement. The one giving Nolan control." "Yes." "Did you watch him sign it?" That question changed everything. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "No." Miriam explained that she had prepared documents based on instructions she believed came from Dad. But during the final weeks, Nolan had become the primary point of contact. Dad was too weak to travel. Documents were delivered to his house. Nolan returned them. Signed. Miriam had spoken to Dad by phone, but the conversations were short. "Did Dad personally tell you to give Nolan 51%? I asked. She stared at the desk. "Not in those exact terms." My anger rose. "What exact terms did he use?" "He said he wanted both sons protected." "That is not the same thing." "No." "Did you question the change?" "Yes." "And?" "Nolan told me your father had decided your working relationship had become too strained." I almost laughed, because it was completely false. Dad and I had never been closer. Even during his final months, I visited him every day. Nolan hadn't just changed paperwork. He had created a story around it. Miriam began reviewing her records. Emails, file versions, revision timestamps. What we found over the next 2 days made my stomach turn. The original succession structure had been drafted nearly 18 months earlier. I controlled voting shares. Nolan received substantial non-controlling equity. That structure remained almost unchanged through 4 revisions. Then, 3 months before Dad passed, something shifted. Miriam began receiving emails from an account supposedly belonging to Dad. The messages requested changes. Short ones. Formal. Nothing like how Dad normally wrote. One email said, "Adjust control so Nolan holds final voting authority." Miriam had replied asking for confirmation. The response came 11 minutes later. Confirmed. But when we checked login records stored through the company system, the messages had been sent from a device used frequently inside Nolan's office. Not Dad's house. Nolan had not simply taken advantage of confusion. He had been impersonating our father. I wanted to believe it had happened only during Dad's final months. That would have been easier. Desperation. Greed. A terrible decision made under pressure. But the records told a different story. Nolan had been collecting information for nearly 2 years. He requested copies of shareholder records before Dad became seriously ill. He asked our accountant about transfer procedures. He downloaded templates for corporate authority changes. He even requested older signatures from archived contracts. At the time, each action looked harmless. Together, they formed a plan. The brother who told me he had no idea Dad would choose him had spent years preparing for exactly that outcome. And suddenly, I remembered every conversation differently. Every question. Every private meeting. Every time he offered to organize Dad's paperwork. None of it was random. Miriam found another email. This one wasn't about ownership. It was about me. Nolan had written to Dad from his own account almost a year earlier. He told Dad I was secretly exploring offers to sell the company. I wasn't. He claimed I had told managers the company would collapse without me. I hadn't. He suggested I was intentionally preventing Nolan from taking responsibility. That wasn't true either. And then I saw Dad's reply. It was only 2 sentences. "Grant has never given me reason to doubt him. If there is a problem between you, solve it with your brother." Dad had defended me. Nolan had failed to turn him against me. So he changed tactics. If he couldn't convince Dad to erase me, he would wait until Dad could no longer stop him. I asked Nolan to meet me in Dad's old office. He arrived irritated. "You pulled me out of a supplier meeting." I placed the missing page on the desk. Everything changed. His eyes went to Dad's handwriting, then to me. For 3 seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Nolan said, "Where did you get that?" "Not. What is that?" "Not. I've never seen that before." He asked where I got it, and that told me enough. "You knew about this page." He leaned back. "It's an old draft." "Then why was it missing?" "Because drafts change. Dad's final instructions didn't." Nolan's face hardened. "You don't know that. I know the emails came from your device." That was when he stopped pretending. Nolan walked toward the window. For years, I had imagined what betrayal looked like. I thought people apologized, cried, admitted they had made a terrible mistake. Nolan didn't. He defended himself. "You had everything." I stared at him. "What?" "Dad's trust. The company. The employees. Every important decision. I worked for those things. And I never got the chance." "You quit every chance he gave you." He turned sharply. "Because you were always there making me look incompetent." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I spent years covering for you." "That's exactly it." "What?" "You got to be the dependable one." I became the disappointment. I shook my head. "Nolan, nobody assigned those roles. We made our choices." His eyes narrowed. "No. You had 20 years beside him. I was never going to catch up. So you stole it." He looked directly at me. I corrected an imbalance. That sentence ended something between us. Not because of the company. Because I finally understood how he saw my life. Every sacrifice I had made was, to him, an advantage. Every weekend I worked was favoritism. Every crisis I solved was another reason he believed I had stolen something from him. He didn't see 20 years of effort. He saw 20 years of evidence that Dad trusted me more. And instead of becoming trustworthy himself, he decided trust was something he could manufacture on paper. I asked one last question. "How long?" He didn't answer. "How long were you planning this?" He looked away. Then he said, "Long enough to know Dad would never change things while you were standing beside him." That was the moment the company stopped matching. My own brother had spent years waiting for our father to become vulnerable. Not to care for him, to get around him. Miriam told me we had enough evidence to challenge the succession documents. But I hesitated. Not because I doubted the truth. Because I knew what would happen to the company. Employees would hear rumors. Customers might panic. Suppliers could tighten terms. Dad had spent 4 decades building a reputation. I didn't want his final legacy to become a fight between his sons. Then Nolan made the decision for me. The following Monday, he terminated my employment. No discussion. No warning. He sent a formal notice through Human Resources. After 20 years, my brother removed me from the building our father had once told me I would run. Nolan's reason? Leadership restructuring. That afternoon, I filed the challenge. I expected most employees to stay out of it. Instead, people came forward. A former assistant remembered Nolan asking for samples of Dad's signature. Our controller remembered unusual requests for financial authority forms. A warehouse manager recalled Dad complaining that paperwork kept appearing he didn't understand. Then Dad's former executive assistant brought us something important. A handwritten meeting note from nearly 9 months before his passing. Dad had dictated instructions for the company. One sentence read, "Grant runs operations permanently. Nolan benefits financially, but control must stay with experience." There it was again. Not one draft. Not one memory. A pattern. Dad's intention had been consistent. The paperwork had changed. He hadn't. Miriam blamed herself. She called me one evening and said, I should have insisted on speaking with Everett alone. I told her the truth. Yes, you should have. She went silent. I wasn't trying to hurt her, but pretending everyone had done their best would have been another lie. Miriam had trusted Nolan's access. I had trusted Nolan's intentions. Dad had trusted both of us to protect what he built. Every failure came from the same assumption, that family proximity meant honesty. It doesn't. Closeness gives someone access. Character determines what they do with it. 2 weeks before the hearing, Nolan asked to meet. Not in the office. At a quiet coffee shop across town. He looked exhausted. For the first time, he seemed less confident. He offered me 45% ownership if I dropped the challenge. You keep your shares, he said. I'll increase them. We move forward. And you stay in control. Yes. I almost admired the nerve. You still think this is about percentages. What else is it about? Dad. Nolan looked down. You used his weakness. He wasn't helpless. You knew he was confused. He knew enough. You sent messages pretending to be him. His jaw tightened. You can't prove everyone. That sentence told me there were more. I didn't know how many. And suddenly I realized even Nolan might not remember the full extent of what he had changed. I stood up. No deal. I won't pretend the legal process was dramatic. Most of it was documents. Dates. Technical questions. Records. But one moment stayed with me. Nolan's attorney argued that Dad may have changed his mind late in life. Then Miriam was asked whether she had any evidence of Dad personally requesting Nolan receive controlling authority. She said, no. Then she was asked whether she had evidence showing Dad wanted me to retain control before his health declined. She answered, yes, repeatedly. The missing page was entered into evidence. So were Dad's handwritten notes, the emails, the login records, the old meeting instructions. For nearly 2 years, Nolan had built a hidden path toward ownership, and now every step was visible. The disputed succession agreement was invalidated. Nolan's controlling authority was suspended. Dad's prior documented structure was restored while the estate process was corrected. That meant I regained control. People congratulated me. Employees hugged me when I returned to the warehouse. Walter smiled and said, your father would be relieved. But I didn't feel victorious. Because winning back the company didn't give me back my brother. Nolan resigned before I returned. He cleared his office over a weekend. No farewell. No apology. He left Dad's old desk completely empty. Except for one photograph. It showed the 3 of us at a company picnic 15 years earlier. Dad in the middle. Nolan on one side. Me on the other. We looked happy. Maybe we were. Or maybe I just hadn't understood the resentment growing beside me. Months later, while reviewing boxes from Dad's house, I found an envelope with my name on it. Inside was a short letter. Dad had written it more than a year before he passed. He told me he knew the company had taken a lot from my life. He thanked me for staying. Then he wrote something I wasn't expecting. He said, take care of your brother if he lets you. But never confuse taking care of someone with letting them avoid responsibility. I read that sentence several times. Dad knew Nolan better than I thought. Maybe he had spent years hoping Nolan would grow into responsibility. Maybe I had too. Hope makes you patient. Sometimes too patient. A year after everything happened, Holloway Industrial Supply was stable again. I promoted 2 managers who had earned more responsibility. I created safeguards requiring independent confirmation for major ownership changes. And I made sure no single family member could quietly rewrite the company's future again. Nolan and I did not speak for nearly 10 months. Then one afternoon, I received a short message from him. I know saying sorry doesn't fix what I did. That was all. I stared at it for several minutes. Then I replied, no, it doesn't. I didn't block him. I didn't forgive him instantly either. Some wounds don't need revenge. They need boundaries. For a long time, I thought the missing page was what saved me. It wasn't. The page saved the company. The truth saved me. Because before Walter showed up, I had started believing Dad had rejected everything I had done. I thought maybe 20 years beside him had meant less than I believed. That pain was heavier than losing money. He had been my mentor, my father, the person whose approval shaped most of my adult life. Learning that he had not abandoned me mattered more than regaining control. My brother had tried to steal ownership, but what nearly destroyed me was believing he had stolen my father's trust too. He hadn't. Dad had trusted me until the end. Today, Dad's old metal desk sits in my office. The same one from the first warehouse. The drawer still jams. I could replace it. I don't. It reminds me where the company started. And it reminds me that what people build together cannot always be measured in ownership percentages. Nolan wanted control because he believed control would rewrite our history. It didn't. Documents can be altered. Titles can be changed. Names can be removed from offices. But 20 years of showing up leaves evidence everywhere. In employees who remember. In customers who know who answered the phone during a crisis. In old notes. In forgotten folders. And sometimes, in one missing page someone thought would never be found. I lost a brother I thought I knew. But I recovered something more important than a company. I recovered the truth about my father. And I learned that loyalty is not proven by what someone says when everyone is watching. It is proven by what they protect when they believe no one will ever find out.